Man hoisted sail before he saddled the horse. He poled and paddled along rivers and navigated the open seas before he traveled on wheels along a road. Watercraft were the first of all vehicles. With them the Stone Age world began to shrink. By hoisting sail or merely traveling with the current, early man was able to settle the islands. Territories that could be reached over land only by generations of gradual transmigration for those who had to confront obstacles like swamps and lifeless tundra, naked mountains and impenetrable jungles. Glaciers and deserts could be reached in weeks by casual drift or by navigation. Watercraft were man's first major tool for his conquest of the world. Thor Heyerdahl in the beginning of navigation, 1972.
I remembered the line from the Hindu scripture, the Bhagavad Gita. Vishnu is trying to persuade the prince that he should do his duty, and to impress him takes on his multi-armed form and says, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." I suppose we all thought that one way or another.
Hello and welcome. We are back. You are back. I thank you for it. I hope you didn't feel like last episode was too much of an introduction, without any follow-up, and that nothing new of substance was put forward that you haven't heard before. Today things will get heavier. First off, thanks to the new Patreons that have arrived since the last episode. You are such an encouragement. Thank you. I hope that some of you others will share the show on social media, and if you can spare some change, know that I'm a diagnosed psychotic farmer who has lost his farmland and who is literally looking up DIY wood-burning stoves on YouTube. The saddest of all creatures. So head on over to Patreon so I can get some land back while I keep making episodes. And maybe buy a new computer for the first time in 10 years. This tablet is getting really old. I promise I will not pay pallet over to a gun factory in Mindanao or Dandarakanya. I have also linked some recent interviews over there that I have done on other podcast shows. It's all public, so you don't have to pay if you don't have the means. Having mainly criticized the hegemons in the last episode, it's only in order that I also sum up my critique of the ever more popular contemporary alternative history tellers out there. The YouTube videos of which the view count match or outnumber the conventional storytelling of the popular topics. Topics such as the megaliths at the Temple of Jupiter in Baalbek, the earthquake-defying walls of Sacsayhuaman and Machu Picchu, those atomic bunker-looking caves in South Asia's Barabar, the ingenuity of the Antikythera mechanism, or whatever it is that the long gone and educated are trying to tell us in their writing and painting on the stones found in Karnak and Giza, and so on and so on. The major problem facing the popular alternative historians of our time is, I think, quite apparent. Despite the somewhat desperate claims of people like John Anthony West that what he and his fellow travelers are doing is rewriting the entirety of history, proving that what he calls quackademia is wrong on all accounts, I feel that their dream remains the same as that of the bourgeoisie. They claim a paradigm shift, but a paradigm, i.e. a pattern, still symptomatically remains in their reasoning. Because I'm sorry, but I think if you depend entirely on the notion of lost ancient high technology, alien or otherwise, in your exploration, then the same positivist spirit that underlies all contemporary hegemonic thought of the 19th century industrialist classes and their idealist historians is still very well and alive. Simply put, there will ultimately be nothing new under the sun if you think technology is the primary and or only engine of history. I think instead that the only sound way of understanding the faraway past is to emphasize these so-called primitive people's vast spectrum of practical knowledge. That spectrum of competence which the old Greeks tried to describe to us with words such as episteme as opposed to doxa, or techne, i.e. having actual experience of doing something and not just theory crafting a worldview based on a reaction against that doxa, as well as my personal favorite phronesis. Phronesis is, one could say, the marriage of the two aforementioned categories, techne and episteme. That is the practical philosophy of perfection, through repeated failures and through them discarding the superfluous and unnecessary. A praxis which predates the Greeks with many tens of thousands of years. Thus my formula at its most basic is this. Rather than lending primitive people advanced technology to rock your boat, let's try to recognize how much can be done with primitive means of production if you have an advanced organization of the productive forces, planning of the economy, and useful applicable advanced knowledge of astronomy, winds, streams and other natural phenomena. Now, if indeed some of the alternative historians don't emphasize technology, they still somehow do, since they often wrap up all of history into a story of lost lineage, of some magical spiritual power that would compensate for all the things they still hope technology will do for us. Another common thing to be pointed out within these circles is how these ancient cultures seem to appear out of nowhere. And it is true that there often seems to be a sudden developmental jump, so to speak, when studying some of these megalithic sites. But what is it exactly that comes out of nowhere? Let's take the construction of pyramids, for example, to gradually illustrate my point. They are present all over the world, among the Mayas, the Incas, Aztecs, Egypt, Sudan, China, Indonesia. Wherever one looks, people seem to have been building pyramids. Seldomly when talking about this sudden jump to the fringe archaeologists who are looking for either antediluvians, interstellar Pleiadians, or some other survivors of a lost civilization, stop to question what might have happened to the socio-economic organization of society when the productive forces are suddenly channeled to build these wonders. They only seem to want to talk about a mysterious transfer of technology and dream about what kind of tools were used, be they lasers or telekinesis. They should instead stop and ask themselves the following. If this new order of things pops out of nowhere, then what happened to that very long legacy of advanced knowledge that came before, which seems to be lingering within the details of these material manifestations of that sudden new order? Lingering as documented theory with experiment and result. What was the use of that process when it was put into praxis, before being written down in stone? I, just like many of you, have surely been amazed by all the information and data which, for example, the pyramids of Giza contain. Everything from the circumference of our globe, its height, mass, its relative size to other celestial objects, the speed with which it turns, recurring degrees in relation to the equator, true north positioning within a hair's breadth fraction of a degree, and the list goes on. I've even seen interesting calculations that seem to suggest knowledge of the speed of sound or light. But we shouldn't only stand in wonder of the pyramids just because they let us know that the ancients knew of these things. I say this cautiously since architecture, throughout the ages, never lies. Architecture, more than politics, is a clear expression of that previously mentioned order of things. That is why it is called real estate, as in an expression of how people perceive the structure of their own social formation. And in that sense, these pyramids are politically sus, in my opinion, where many stones are at the bottom, and a few, or one, is on the top. In their unmistakable basic appearance, together with a division of labor modeled after that shape, those structures served as central points of symbolic, imaginary and real gravity, from which a lot of hate, barbarity and brutal war was cascaded back out. Whether that's a later use performed by lesser men who rediscovered them already in ancient times, we will continue to speculate upon. But having said that, and regarding the earlier question, are these megalithic manifestations built merely to store or claim that information as its own? Egyptologists are learning more and more today how many pharaohs would remove the name of a predecessor and anachronistically insert their own name in its stead. But what if that was always taking place? What if the ancients technically knew everything needed to build a pyramid long before they did so? And that the pyramids are nothing but a claim on a tradition that made different use of all that mathematical, astronomical and geometrical phronesis, which we see present in the choice of lengths and positioning of the structures. A different theoretical structure for a different practical purpose was already there before someone expressed it as a pyramid. Put in a better, more bombastic way, is the collected sum of the general intellect of its time and presented thus there to enlighten or confuse? The common Egyptologist will only look towards the organization of the productive forces in terms of an order of domination that they are familiar with, as in that of brute force. Thus they perceive the builders as slaves under the sword. In so doing, they underestimate the power of the ideological state apparatus and dislike the possibility of free subjects basically having unconsciously constructed their own cosmic panopticon. I think they do so because the sword is easy to explain, but the carrot, however, why now you need to wonder just how we were historically bribed as a species. We need to consider its desires, fears and hopes. And suddenly, we would probably find ourselves in the same boat as the ancients, with the same problems and the same guilty pleasures. Instead, they keep these audible sphinx riddles at a foreclosed arm's length, by dressing it all up in sometimes beautiful, sometimes banal prose, that hopes to capture the sentiment or religious feeling of a subject living many thousands of years ago, which is doomed to fail, and they know it is. That is why they do it. It's a sort of pseudo-activity of half-invested engagement that keeps primitive and advanced subjectivity separated. We now are the adults, and those people then are children. Those with alternative theories can't be blamed for a lack of engagement. As a matter of fact, they many times seem actually very much energetically under the spell of the ideology of supposedly long gone ruling classes. But I have a hard time believing that the auspicious numbers and shapes that reoccur again and again is only there to serve as a template for a psychedelic trip, where visions of so-called sacred geometry flashes before one's eyes and eye, deepening that ontological, phenomenological phantasm. A psychotropic transference which, unfortunately for their independence, invests ever higher wattages of libido in the limestone shine of the subject supposed to know. Le sujet supposé savoir. Even though this big other, clearly, dare I say ultimately, is nothing but a pile of nicely polished and fitted rocks. It doesn't get more basic. It doesn't get more original or terminal. That's why it works through so well. Our aesthetic values are curiously still the same when it comes to filling in the gap that is the trauma of death's eternal unconsciousness. So what is it really for then, you might ask? Because I don't want to become worthy in the gaze of that which was just hinted at. Sounds like a very old magic trick. What are all these cosmological numbers, shapes, forms and names that make out the blueprint for these constructions? What are they a trace legacy of? For those who have read that book, Hamlet's Mill, I'm sure you have at least a similar suspicion that behind it all lies a proto-ideology that might have covered the whole world. Actually, in one sense, I know that it has always already literally covered the whole world. I won't say that I understood everything that was put forward in that book, but it seems clear that behind the similarities of the world's many traditions of folklore, religion and mythology lies a common backdrop of the astronomical dome with its stars, asterisms and constellations, the first ideograph for that proto-inspiration, the canvas of original sense-making. But again, is it all there then to only take us on a trip? Or is this trip much more substantial? And are these auspicious numbers, shapes, forms and names, in short, that sacred geometry, is it actually, if we strip away the sublime, real weights and measurements, functional guides for how to take a real trip? A trip that requires astronomy to perform the skill of sea navigation when all else has left you behind. Because isn't that what's really cool about all this? That the movements of the night sky and the equinoxes are in one sense at the same time a gigantic cosmological clock and compass. Space and time as tools, the true astral planes, with truly helpful entities, where one doesn't need to take acid to feel the relativity of it all. Since if one was to sail too far in a certain direction, one would suddenly get the feeling that those constellations wake up and go to sleep at an unusual increasing or decreasing rate. And if one was to steer too far off course, or fail to return for too long, some new messengers might appear over the horizon once the sun sets. Star clusters that you never wanted to encounter, because that is what has been passed down as the last thing some very sorry ancestors saw depicted on night's time-space drama right before they got shipwrecked in the wrong waters. Very cold, very empty, very salty. Good thing some survived and dropped some nightmarish wisdom to an aspiring, up-and-coming generation of explorers around the campfire. A meeting and transferring of knowledge, which, for the record, considering how one doesn't choose how one floats ashore and is saved, might not unfold in the same language or be with youngsters of the same flesh and blood, but nonetheless children of a similar latitude enough for the written in sand and gestured story to make sense. In other more concrete words, the superstructure of religious feeling and the social narrative of the moving planetary celestial world, I would say, grew out of a more functional experience of trying to remember and perfect the art and science of sea and land navigation. Likewise, it is thus my estimation that these megalithic sites and the archaeoastronomical clues that they have left behind are an elaboration and or confusion of that body of work that is the knowledge of how to really freely explore this universe of ours. Again, we will leave the possibility open that these sites were once great gathering points, wondrous universities of real teachers, not the mere geopolitical hubs of exploiters, which we know they had been in latter so-called civilized Bronze Age times. This hypothesis might seem stupid at first, and it will take some time to unpack it, and I have to prove myself by laying forth what I have discovered in more detail, beyond the more general picture. I know that. And when I say discovered, I partly mean something experienced when you wander begging for food, years on end, sleeping in abandoned houses, fighting and allying with the elements, trying to follow the natural pointing out instructions of that luminous astral backdrop which we have been speaking about. But I also try to read a lot, because phronesis, right? Phronesis. So I hope you feel some chemistry with this place of departure, because I don't want to give the credit of all that mathematics, astronomy, surveying, and accurate measuring and weighing to a federation of kings, a priestess class, or a conspiracy of ancient secret societies whom I believe built or occupied these monuments to cover up their primordial crime of having robbed seasonally nomadic people of their class freedom. And I'll say this apropos a transfer of technology, which Graham likes to talk about, that institutional agriculture is not a gift of progress, nor is civilization and high-density urbanization. They are the getting stuck, the structuring of barbarism, an unnecessary restraining extra on the planned economic praxis of traveling natural farmers and sea foragers. A tradition which we know goes back more than 30,000 years, ultra deep into the last glacial maximum and possibly beyond. I'm not trying to be a downer. What I'm looking for with those words, traveling natural farmers and sea foragers, is amazing and mind-blowing. And what I hope that this outlook will do is that it will continue to pry open not only the natural gates of the Strait of Gibraltar, but all the gates to the seven seas, wherever they may be, and that you will be encouraged to venture into prehistoric times looking for our seaborne ancestors. And when doing so, who am I to tell you not to aim for Atlantis? But if you do, at least for mine and Fergal Schmudlak's sake, let them be the kingless ones. But enough of my dreaming. What does our good old Thor Heyerdahl say about this prehistoric community of human beings? What had their practical philosophy made them capable of? How early in the story of our species did they know exactly when, how, and in what way to cut reeds, bind it, assemble it, and construct it into boats, to do just exactly what his expeditions did? Because you got it right, dear listeners. Beyond all that noise, that's what he proved. That theoretically, as soon as you have the cutters of the Acheulean industry that began over 1 million years ago, and as long as you have the thumb and the index finger necessary for the precision grip, with curiosity and an oral tradition to keep track of the failures and successes, that procedure which we call the scientific empirical model, someone, race and ethnicity unknown to us, could have followed and listened to those snakes, those streams that lie slithering almost invisible just beneath the surface of the oceans, and without putting legs on them to make monsters such as the Leviathan, devils such as Cthulhu, dragons such as Bakunava, or feathered serpents like Quetzalcoatl. Those currents would have taken them, you and me included, from Africa to the Caribbeans, from South America to Polynesia, and then finally from Indonesia back again to Madagascar. Wait, Marcus. Are you saying that there was once upon a time a proto-communist social formation on this blue planet of ours that sailed the seven seas without the intention of circulating commodities, but merely guided by human intuitive curiosity? The same curiosity that your boy expresses in the background of some of your recordings as he crawls around fearlessly, looking for undiscovered delights of the senses. Well, dear listener, let's see what the archaeological, anthropological, and linguistic evidence tells us.
Why do ships with sails love the wind? And will I be thinking of you? Will I ever pass this way again? I'll be returning someday. Until then, please don't ask me my direction. Let my tracks be buried in the sea, 'cause to wander's my invention, till the four winds bring you back to me. Don't count your memories, think of me as just a dream, just like this melody I sing. Well, you asked how much I love you. Why do ships with sails love the wind? And will I be thinking of you? Will I ever pass this way again? I'll be returning someday. Until then, please don't ask me my
If we have to start somewhere, I guess perhaps we should start with the history of shipbuilding and seafaring. A couple of centuries ago, when sail still ruled the sea, it was usual to assume that the ancient civilized people were capable of almost unlimited movement. After all, the vessels of Magellan, Captain Cook, and many others had sailed around the world once or twice with only the wind to help them. So why not the ancient peoples? But when we invented the propeller and the jet, and the world grew smaller and smaller for rising generations, we began to acquire the idea that going back through the ages, it must have been larger and larger, until in the days before Columbus the world must have been endless and the ocean impassable. In the first half of the present century, when steamships and aeroplanes replaced large and small sailing ships at sea, the attitude grew among modern anthropologists that until the ribbed and planked wooden hull was invented and acquired a large dimension, man was restricted to voyages on inland and coastal waters. The possibility of transoceanic contact with America before the existence of the small but lofty caravels, like those of Columbus in 1492, were deemed impossible for practical maritime reasons. We talked about the two intersecting evolutionary lines of shipbuilding briefly in the last episode. One is the principle of using material that is in itself buoyant, and the other is to displace water with air by making the hull watertight. Since the latter is the one used in the European tradition of discovery, the standard textbook idea of marine architecture is that in order to cross short stretches of water, man first rode astride a log. To keep his feet dry, he next thought of hollowing it out with adze and fire, and as he ventured among bigger waves, he added more and more side planks to keep the water from splashing in, until he eventually arrived at a hollow hull with a waterproof deck high above the sea's surface, so that he could defy even the most violent movements of the waves. With ever bigger hulls, it has been assumed, he ventured even farther into the open ocean. Hardly a textbook during the time of Heyerdahl's expeditions diverges from this version of how man built his first ships. Yet on closer examination, this long-established dogma runs contrary to known facts. I guess you can already see that what is almost completely absent in the explanation is the first principle of buoyancy by the material which does not need to be watertight. As a matter of fact, a well-made raft or a reed boat, again both missing in this evolution, can be flooded again and again without sinking, because, well, it floats, that is what it does. With canoes you have a sort of compromise of the two evolutionary lines which can develop on its own in, for example, the direction of the North American long canoes that are equipped for deep sea travel, or the Polynesian catamarans, or the Maori waka, which can be up to 40 meters long. We mentioned that when canoes of that size were made in Hawaii, they were made of large pine that had drifted there from British Colombia. That ready-made canoes, and not mere drift logs, could survive the same crossing was proved by Captain Voss in 1901. He procured a 38-foot Northwest Indian canoe called Tilikum at Vancouver Island and sailed it from there straight to Tongareva in central Polynesia in 2 months, whereupon he continued to New Zealand and westward, eventually crossing the whole world, arriving in London 1904. And with that tale, you know Heyerdahl is not dissing the canoe, but instead the aforementioned doxa when he says that, quote, a re-examination of the earliest boat illustrations in existence shows that ships developed out of the first of these two categories, and not, as had commonly been assumed, out of the dugout canoe, end of quote. Old world art shows clearly that in the Mediterranean countries the first form of wooden ship was developed out of an earlier form of reed boat. Reed boats and reed boat illustrations have been found throughout the Mediterranean, from Mesopotamia, Egypt, the coasts of present-day Syria, Lebanon, and Israel by way of Cyprus, Crete, Corfu, Malta, Italy, Sardinia, Libya, Algeria, and out through the Straits of Gibraltar to the Atlantic coast of Morocco. Such reed boats, also shown on Phoenician jars, have been in sporadic use from Mesopotamia to Atlantic Morocco until the present century, while rock carvings and cliff paintings from Egypt and the Algerian Sahara show that they were already in use 5, 6, and even 7,000 years ago. In the Gobustan Petroglyph Reserve in Azerbaijan, there are more than 6,000 petroglyphs, carved among them depictions of reed boats, made by the seafarers who lived in these caves 12,000 to 20,000 years ago. The earliest discovered remains from a reed boat are 7,000 years old, found at the H3 site in Kuwait. They were also constructed from early times in Peru and Bolivia, and boats with remarkably similar designs have been found in Easter Island and many other places. The greatest number of early representations of such boats is found in the desert area of Egypt between the Nile Valley and the Red Sea. In a monograph of these Nubian rock carvings by Walter Resch, the numerous illustrations show that, apart from human and animal figures, reed boats are by far the dominant motif. And the reed boats are the only man-made product depicted, apart from weapons. One is struck by the fact that the majority of these sickle-shaped vessels has a numerous crew, sometimes 50 men or more. In addition to the double steering oars, some show 40 or more rowing oars in the water, while a considerable number have mast and rigging, and in many cases a large hoisted sail. The great dimensions of these vessels are indicated not only by the number of men and oars, but also by the fact that horned cattle and other large animals are dwarfed on their decks. It is not uncommon that 1 or even 2 cabins are shown on deck, one fore and one aft of the mast. Heyerdahl says that his crew's papyrus ship, Ra 2, in which this inexperienced 8-man crew sailed across the Atlantic in 1970, was small compared with the larger of these illustrated vessels, dating back to 1 or 2 millennia before the rise of the first dynasty in Egypt. It is of course indicative that many of these sites where reed boat paintings are found are today's deserts, telling us that, for example, the Nubian desert was once covered in forests and rivers. Masanobu Fukuoka, my agricultural mentor, says, though I'm not personally fully convinced yet, that all deserts we know today are man-made, caused by the mismanagement of institutionalized intensive agriculture throughout the ages. He also says that farming without domestication, which is one of the many definitions of natural farming, was practiced for over 50,000 years in the Americas, and possibly way before that. A method which, it has been documented, can compete and surpass the output of modern industrial farming, but which demands higher level of phronesis, i.e. practical philosophy. Unlike modern farming requirements of leveled horizontal fields, it is also very suitable to island jumping, even when those islands have a hilly landscape. Periodic absence, though not abandonment on the part of the natural farmer, often even improves the quality of the food forest, the semi-wild veggies, cereals and fruits of which a mere acre can feed a group of 16 people throughout the year. I refrain from using the word subsistence farming because that makes it sound like it's incapable of producing a surplus. It can. However, it chooses not to lend that surplus to the process of reification and commodification. Thus historians of prehistory who seldomly have agricultural experience, feel there is a distinction of production or efficiency, which is to miss the actual politics of the distinction. In his study of the seafaring merchants of Ur, A.L. Oppenheim shows that the rich influx of ivory into southern Mesopotamia in the earliest cultural periods came from either Egypt or India, with the Persian Gulf island of Bahrain as a central maritime marketplace for the Mesopotamian navigators. As shown by S.R. Rao, Indus Valley seals have been excavated archaeologically from inside areas of Mesopotamia, ranging from Ur and Uruk near the Persian Gulf to Tel Brak in Syria, near the Turkish border. And G.F. Dales deducts from recent excavations of elaborate ports constructed by the early Harappans of the Indus Valley that they were engaged in, quote, highly organized sea trading ventures, end of quote, to Mesopotamia and other countries to the west. Imported ivory plaques carved with characteristic Egyptian motifs are so common among archaeological finds from ancient Mesopotamia that most museums in Iraq contain specimens, and the National Museum in Baghdad has devoted an entire hall to these locally found Egyptian art objects. It is less known, however, that P. Amiet, in his study of the first form of hieroglyphics in Mesopotamia, discovered that the earliest pre-cuneiform signs for ship was identical with the one representing marine in the script of ancient Egypt. As shown earlier by A. Falkenstein, this hieroglyphic sign for ship is very common in the earliest Sumerian texts of Mesopotamia, dating back to about 3000 BC. It actually represents a sickle-shaped reed boat with crosswise lashings and with some peculiar S-shaped adornments, both bow and stern. This goes to show that before the two respective continental civilizations took root in Mesopotamia and Egypt, about 3000 BC, these two areas on each side of the Arabian Peninsula had already a most peculiar hieroglyphic sign in common, with the same basic meaning and with ornamental details so special that they are never repeated elsewhere in the world. The bow or stern section of the same type of ship is used as a separate hieroglyphic sign. Falkenstein shows that in the earliest Mesopotamian script, the Sumerian sign for lord is represented by the mere stem of such a reed ship, presumably the usual place for its master. That the building of the pyramids was itself built on an organization of the productive forces and maritime networks that covered 3 continents and 3 of the known Vavilov centers of agricultural diversity, or cradles of civilizations, as others call them, might be missed as a point of interest if you are only looking for stone-cutting lasers. But speaking a little about lost technology, the Harappans, or the Indus Valley civilization, developed a lost wax casting technique 6,000 to 7,000 years ago. But who knows, could be older. That's a play on words though, if you didn't get it, since lost here refers to the mold that is being used when casting. But still, it is still pretty awesome to imagine people in Mohenjo-daro playing Warhammer 40,000 made out of intricate gold and copper figurines. You can look up the dancing girl bronze statue and then consider thousands of years of erosion to get a picture of just how intricate. And I think it's interesting that many of their boats are padded with asphalt, when in a roundabout way the thing that we think symbolizes the state or standard of a civilization today, well, it is how good their roads are, and they use the same material to transport themselves. There also seems to be a lot of talk about casting not just metal, but stone these days, which I'm not going to get into, but somewhat related. If computer scientist Subhash Kak and documentary maker B.N. Siddharth is correct, they could have been playing Warhammer as far back as 10,000 BC, long before the Aryan invasions. Personally, I just don't know. More established is that from the hieroglyphic signs and from religious and mnemonic art, it is clear that reed ships were an integral part of Mesopotamian culture prior to the local establishment of city-states, and that this was probably the only watercraft known during the period of the earliest dynasties in Egypt. Amiet in fact points out that said hieroglyphic sign corresponds to a vessel so ancient that its special shape went out of use during the early dynasty and was thence preserved for religious use, although common forms of reed boats survived in former Sumerian territories until the present century. The seagoing ships of ancient Ur and the valuable cargoes from foreign lands are constantly referred to in the earliest Sumerian clay tablets, and Oppenheim points out that these vessels, quote, are exceedingly large, end of quote. The Third Dynasty records giving them sizes of 300 gur, which equals 96,000 liters, or almost 100 tons. In his thorough study of the watercraft of the early Babylonians, A. Salonen refers to tablets describing ships carrying over 50 tons of cargo, and he too points out that shipbuilding in Mesopotamia clearly began with reed ships, and that these later served as models of prototypes when the first plank-built vessels came into use. For example, when the artist employed by the early pharaohs depicted legendary vessels assigned to the period of the early gods and first divine ancestors of man, these were invariably shown as sickle-shaped reed boats, constructed of papyrus stems, lashed together and commonly terminating with a symbolic papyrus flower at each gracefully upcurved end. Here too, the sun god, bird-headed deities, and other ancestral culture heroes of all kinds were invariably shown performing all their water travel on papyrus vessels, never on wooden craft. The ancient artists show only the latter historic pharaohs using wooden boats side by side with the older form of papyrus vessel, and by the 2nd millennium BC, nearly all larger ships appeared to be of sewn planks. Only hunting vessels and poor men's craft continued to be of bundled papyrus. The striking observation is that all of these wooden ships imitated the shape of the papyrus boat in every detail, even to the high and sweeping curves of bow and stern, terminating in the characteristic beaker shape of the papyrus prototype. Thus infinite trouble was taken by the carpenter, working in rigid timber, to copy from the ancestral papyrus boats the extremely intricate curves which had resulted so naturally from the flexible reeds. This puzzling fact was dramatically brought into focus by the discovery of the well-preserved cedar planks of the entire vessel of Cheops, found in a slab-covered chamber at the foot of his own supposed pyramid. When Egypt's chief curator of archaeology, Ahmed Joseph, succeeded in piecing all the huge planks together by threading new ropes through the former lashing holes, the world was confronted with the oldest boat in existence. Built some 2,700 years before Christ, it had an overall length of 143 feet and was so perfectly streamlined and elegant that the Vikings had not built anything more graceful or more ship-shaped when some millennia later they began to sail the high seas in smaller vessels with similar lines. The most striking difference between the two seemingly related types of ship was that the Viking hull was built to bear the brunt of the ocean rollers, while Cheops' ship was built for pomp and ceremony on the placid Nile. Wear and tear on the wood, where the former ropes had shaft furrows, showed that Cheops' ship had been in proper use and was not a quote solar ship, end of quote, built for the pharaoh's funeral. Yet its perfect maritime lines were misleading. It would have collapsed on its first encounter with the high seas. This paradox has much to tell us about marine history. The exquisite lines of Cheops' ship, but only the lines, were obviously specialized to perfection for true ocean voyaging. You might remember what I hinted at earlier in the biowarfare series, with the decline of the quality of the sickles during the Bronze Age, where they went from having been very universal in their application during the Ice Age and thousands of years after, to being only fit for use on tax grain monocrop fields of a handful of genetically modified crops, though arguably now more beautiful, almost ceremonial when made out of bronze rather than the teethed stone chips held together by wood. So do we here again see signs of a kind of institutionalization, which does not have, let's say, the progressive independence of its subjects in mind as they usher in new developments? We know that a primary concern for the early grain-based class societies was to make sure people don't leave the tax fields. It is of course also interesting then, what I hinted at also in the previous episode, that when searching the world for builders for Ra II, Heyerdahl were to learn that the only surviving reed boat builders still able to produce a vessel conforming to the long-lost Egyptian Mesopotamian Indus Valley system were the Aymara, Uru, and Quechua Indians of South America.
No te quiere dejar. Que bajes a verme antes que empiece y ya no pare de nevar. Caiga tanta nieve en las montañas, ya no puedas regresar. Baje una avalancha y te deje un poco más cerca del mar. Yo voy a buscarte donde estés y voy pisando el hielo con mis pies. Pierdo el equilibrio y me congelo de una vez.
Las ballenas desde el agua me dicen que me quede aquí en el mar, que también aquí hay montañas sumergidas en la profundidad. O podríamos quedarnos en la cima de algún glaciar, flotando a la deriva que nos lleve donde nos quiera llevar.
Yo voy a buscarte donde estés. Yo voy pisando el hielo con mis pies. Yo voy a buscarte donde estés. Yo voy cielo de una vez. Pierdo el equilibrio y me congelo de una vez.
As we are starting to see the contours of a possibly much smaller world prior to the first states, let's break down some common myths about seafaring. And I have to say that before reading Heyerdahl, I was a victim of pretty much all of them. He says, quote, "4 basic misconceptions must be cleared away before discussions on primitive seafaring possibilities become anywhere near realistic. 1. A watertight hull is not the only, nor is it the best, solution for security at sea. 2. It is wrong to believe that security in ocean travel invariably increases with the size of the vessel and the height of its deck above sea level. 3. The idea that it is easier and safer for primitive navigators to hug the continental coastline than to cross an open ocean is a very common illusion, contrary to facts. 4. The logical conclusion that the distance from A to B equals the distance from B to A is correct ashore, but wrong at sea." He goes through all of these 4 points in detail in a chapter labeled Paths Across the Ocean of that same anthology, Early Man and the Ocean. If you need more convincing, you can look that up. I feel we went through some of the points already, but I'll spend some time talking about the last one, concerning the A to B. Because it is here that we finally talk about ocean streams, and we will have to battle both the diffusionist line and the isolationist. To do that, let's first go back to Polynesia and the Pacific Ocean, where a lot of the trouble lies. When Roggeveen discovered Easter Island in 1722, he noticed to his surprise that the people of Easter Island could themselves count up their ancestors right back to the time of Tiki and Hutumatua, when they first came sailing across the sea, quote, "from a mountainous land in the east, which was scorched by the sun," end of quote. It is here that we find Thor Heyerdahl's notions interesting, since it's a theory which we are beginning to learn based on the natural phenomenon of streams and winds. You see, the Europeans could not sail further east once Marco Polo had sighted the Pacific from Indonesia and China in the late 13th century. The logging of a multitude of European experiments to sail further east once they had first reached Southeast Asia tells us this was something which they again and again for a very long time realized they were incapable of. It was not until Columbus brought the Europeans to America that the geographical gates to the Pacifics were flung wide open for these Europeans. The Spaniards had no sooner crossed the Panama Isthmus and reached the Pacific coast of Peru when the Inca historians recounted that islands inhabited by different people were to be found 2 months' voyage westward from their own empire. They gave correct sailing directions to some of them, including Easter Island, which the Mendafia expedition missed by sheer misfortune due to quarrels on board that led to a last-moment change of course. Nevertheless, it was directly due to the Inca reports that the Spanish caravels set out from Peru on the 2 successive voyages that discovered first Melanesia and then Polynesia. The first Pacific island found by Europeans was Guam in the Marianas, although one of the oceanic islands closest to the European colonists living in the Philippines and located nearest to the Asiatic mainland. It remained unknown until it was discovered in 1521 by Magellan, who came sailing from distant South America. In the following centuries, the rest of Micronesia, including the Carolines, the Marshall, and the Gilbert Islands, were discovered, all of them from America and most of them from Mexico, since the North Equatorial Current, accompanied by the strong trade winds, bears directly down upon Micronesia from that particular area. The second discovery in the Pacific happened to be one of the groups in Melanesia, the Solomon Islands, which, as stated, were found by the Mendaña expedition on a direct voyage from Peru in 1567. Subsequent discoveries in Melanesia all resulted from voyages setting out in the same way from South America, the most important being that of Quiros, who left Peru in 1606 and reached the New Hebrides. Polynesia first became known in 1595 when Mendaña reached the Marquesas group on his second voyage from Peru. Next, the Tuamotu archipelago was first sighted by Quiros in 1606, also sailing from Peru, and in 1616 the Tonga Islands were found by Lemaire and Schoute coming from Chile. Easter Island was found by Roggeveen, as we mentioned, in 1722, he too coming from Chile, and following the same route from South America, Byron encountered the Cook Islands in 1765, and Wallis, following him, came upon Tahiti and the Society Islands in 1767. Thus we can see that it is not distance which is the primary factor in our mapping of early sea route possibilities. Not until 1565 did Urdaneta succeed in discovering the only feasible return route for the sailing ships of that period. He steered northward along the coast of Japan and crossed the Pacific with the Kuroshio current and the westerly winds at his back in the extreme latitudes north of Hawaii. Urdaneta kept an exact log of his course, and from that time this became the so-called caravel route, which Spanish and Portuguese ships followed for more than 2 centuries. This circular route went westward from Mexico to the Philippines in the tropical waters near the equator, and back again across the extreme North Pacific in the empty ocean between Hawaii and the Aleutians. We will have good reason to return to the uniqueness here of the Kuroshio current, since it is in this navigational bottleneck, so to speak, of islands, today known as Japan, that we find pottery that predates the pre-pottery Neolithic, as counterintuitive as that might sound. And in doing research for this miniseries, I went to the museum in Chino, in Nagano, where the Jomon Venus statue is on display, together with hundreds of pots from the deep Ice Age. And I think you will consider some of my finds, dear listener, very interesting. The constant rotation of the very ocean itself and the air above it in this complete hemisphere dominated all European discoveries and trade routes for 500 years, from Marco Polo travels in the 1270s to Captain Cook's voyages in the 1770s. The only explorer who, to a limited extent, managed to outflank this maritime circumvallation was Tasman, who in 1642 sailed due south from Indonesia instead of eastward, and by rounding the southern coast of Australia, first discovered Tasmania south of the Roaring Forties, and then New Zealand. Thereupon he tacked north to Tonga before he was trapped by the tropical conveyor, which sent him back to Indonesia. Not until Captain Cook towards the end of the 18th century entered the then fairly well-known Pacific had modern sailing technique developed so far that it was possible to defy to a degree the rule of the elements. Now, that is not to say that Polynesians, who were in fact already inhabiting these islands, having discovered them long before the Europeans arrived, it is not to say that they couldn't do what the Europeans clearly couldn't do for those first 500 years of their own age of discovery. Heyerdahl himself writes, quote, "In outlining nature's own ocean highways to and from the Americas, it is by no means the author's intention to rule out the possibility of other voyages by primitive mariners. Like present-day captains of small sailing vessels, Aboriginal navigators had invented many types of craft capable of tacking into the wind and thus crossing contrary to the course of the marine conveyors in the calmer ocean regions between them. The balsa raft with correctly manipulated guara set as centerboards between the logs is only one of the Aboriginal sailing vessels that can effectively tack, and the double-bundled reed ships with its negative keel is another, and so is a Polynesian double canoe or catamaran. But forced transoceanic crossings outside the natural ocean routes require supreme navigational skills and would almost certainly not be undertaken without the advanced knowledge that land lay ahead." End of quote. Thus what I'm saying is that these earlier navigational and maritime architectural skills, which surpassed those missions of proto-capitalism, would nonetheless have needed a very long learning phase of more primitive means and previous mapping dating far back in time. A very long phase of history which would probably have followed, and I argue being a community of that earlier described circular route connecting the Aboriginal people of the Pacific Islands as well as North and Central and South America, which the Kon-Tiki expedition from our first episode shows could be traveled with a balsa raft. This hard evidence of the Japan current and all the others is seldomly debated. Instead, those of the dominant theory model still tries to cancel the hands-on-the-deck explorer on their own assumptions about what Thor meant could have happened. You remember what the deal was, but in case you don't follow the order of the episodes, here are two new examples from the Wikipedia article on Polynesians and on Polynesia itself, with different cited sources spanning the time since right after his voyage until today. Quote, "Polynesians are known to have definitely originated from a branch of the Austronesian migration in island Melanesia, despite the popularity of rejected hypotheses, like Thor Heyerdahl's belief that Polynesians are descendants of bearded white men who sailed on primitive rafts from South America." End of quote. And here's another one. Quote, "One of the most enduring misconceptions about Polynesians was that they originated from the Americas. This was due to Thor Heyerdahl's proposal in the mid-20th century that the Polynesians had migrated in two waves of migrations. One by Native Americans from the northwest coast of Canada by large whale hunting dugouts, and the other from South America by bearded white men with reddish to blonde hair and blue-gray eyes, led by a high priest and sun king named Kon-Tiki on balsa log rafts. He claimed the white men then civilized the dark-skinned natives in Polynesia." Again, definitely not what I got from reading his books. The bearded white men story is just a curiosity, not fundamental to the hypothesis, and if someone feels that Heyerdahl is too curious, perhaps then cut him some slack, since in the 40s he did not have access to the same body of work which puts forward a counter-narrative surrounding the ideology of these stories. Still, if it was these old myths, believed by Amerindians as well as Europeans, that finally pushed him to make the Kon-Tiki, we should be glad that he did take it into account. And I can't help but to point out that the generational trauma inheritance, that is the Holocaust of the people of the Americas by the Europeans, will not be lifted or rehabilitated by suggesting that Heyerdahl is a racist. Anyways, I promised already in the previous episode that I was going to drop this whole thing and not return to the topic of ethnically diverse mummies and surrounding evidence from all over the world that do not conform to isolationist theories until we first established something in another place of debate. In the previous Wikipedia article that attempts to gather strength by sarcastically summarizing 50 years of experimental anthropology in a passage, maybe you also noticed here the sentence, quote, known to have definitely originated, end of quote. What's that based on then, you might ask? Is it based on accounts of the native people whose history is being deduced? Question mark? Well, no. This would be the prevailing so-called out of Taiwan model, which was put forward by Peter Bellwood in Cambridge, a man very much inspired by Colin Renfrew, whom he has written about in, quote, Traces of Ancestry, Studies in Honours of Colin Renfrew, end of quote. Similarly to his mentor, but on his own designated turf of academic expertise, he is saying that around 3000 BC, people moved out from Taiwan looking for better places to practice their agriculture, which was causing overpopulation and subsequently colonized the Philippines, Borneo, Polynesia, Madagascar, New Zealand, and Easter Island. Now, we know from the previous episode what happened to Colin Renfrew and his ideas about the Anatolian farmers. So I'll be a bit cheekier and less compromising than last time and say, nice theory, Cambridge honours and salary you got there, Peter. Be a real shame if something were to happen to it. Again. In July 2020, a novel high-density genome-wide DNA analysis of Polynesians and native South Americans claimed that there had been intermingling between Polynesian people and pre-Columbian Zenu people in a period dated between 1150 and 1380. Whether this happened because of indigenous American people reaching eastern Polynesia or because the northern coast of South America was visited by Polynesians is not clear yet. Better yet, research led by University of Leeds has discovered genetic evidence that overturns existing theories about human migration into island Southeast Asia, covering the Philippines, Indonesia, and Malaysia and Borneo, taking the timeline back by nearly 10,000 years. Martin Richards has shown that a substantial fraction of their mitochondrial DNA lineages, inherited down the female line of descent, have been evolving within island Southeast Asia for a much longer period, possibly since modern humans arrived some 50,000 years ago. Moreover, the lineage can be shown to have actually expanded in the opposite direction, into Taiwan, within the last 10,000 years. The professor Martin Richards states, quote, I think the study results are going to be a big surprise for many archaeologists and linguists on whose studies conventional migration theories are based. These population expansions had nothing to do with agriculture, but were most likely to have been driven by climate change, in particular global warming and the resulting sea level rises at the end of the Ice Age between 15,000 and 7,000 years ago. End of quote. History News Network concludes in another report on the research. New genetic research reveals that the migratory story of the Polynesians might be more ancient and complicated than previously thought. Oh, what's that? More ancient and complicated than previously thought, you say? A qualified scientist suddenly, without putting it into radical words, saying that very capable people existed before the advent of class societies, and the primitive accumulation of agriculture had nothing to do with their incentive to develop their societies in various directions. Are we now allowed to ponder that perhaps quite a lot was going on before the cataclysmic event that raised sea levels 12,000 to 11,000 years ago? Wow, if only someone would have guessed as much, even before the atomic bomb, and done some practical maritime research on the matter. In a related paper with the eye-catching title, quote, Almost everything you believed about the Austronesians isn't true, end of quote, by Roger Blench, he sets out to prove that A. viticulture existed in much of island Southeast Asia prior to the Austronesian expansion. B. That the Austronesians, far from being agriculturalists, were fisher-foragers. C. That the dogs, pigs and chickens supposedly characteristic of this expansion reached island Southeast Asia through alternative routes. D. That the linguistic reconstructions that appeared to support the Taiwan model are in fact mosaics of loanwords. E. That the spread of Austronesian language was due to a powerful lifestyle ideology which assimilated indigenous speech communities, and that this can be detected from material culture. Okay, to rehash the picture then, we can deduce 2-3 things here. 1. Polynesians did something that Europeans could not do for 500 years during the Age of Discovery, namely sail in the eastern direction of the Pacific, and we no longer know how early in time they were capable of this. 2. Their advanced navigational skills and their advanced maritime architecture must have had a preceding gradual learning phase when sailing against the winds and the current was not yet possible, and during that time, we don't know how long ago, but my guess is probably deep into the Ice Age time, people from North, Central and South America could have taken the much easier western route on balsa rafts, which would explain why both Polynesian and American stories and archaeological finds speak about this. And I guess conclusively it shows that the dominant voice of Cambridge University in particular, and the Anglo-American educational apparatus in general, is losing its monopoly on knowledge production. Their agriculture theories are showing cracks in their walls, fences and enclosures. The political purpose of agricultural fundamentalism, like that of Renfrew and Bellwood, to just name 2, is a complex ideology, but I feel that we are starting to open up room for historical reasoning, which does not literally depend on history beginning with monocrop taxation and institutionalized domestication of people, crops and animals. A bourgeois class-state narrative from the 19th century which tells us about the genesis which they think took place in the Fertile Crescent, Egypt and Aryan Indus Valley, when Adam was thrown out by God and the serpent to farm the land as punishment. And since we have struck upon an island of breathing space, I feel I have to give credit to Graham Hancock again for pointing out something very important. Remember how it was only in the days of Cook that Europeans learned how to sail against the Western Pacific wind and streams? Citing a book called Shape of the World from 1991, he tells us what happened during those years at the end of the 1700s. Quote, "It would be possible to write an elaborate explanation of longitude and of what needs to be done to fix it precisely for any given point on the Earth's surface. What we are concerned with here, however, is not so much technical details as the accepted historical facts about humanity's growing knowledge of the mysteries of longitude. Among these facts, this is the most important. Until a breakthrough invention in the 18th century, cartographers and navigators were unable to fix longitude with any kind of precision. They could only make guesses, which were usually inaccurate by many hundreds of miles, because the technology had not yet been developed to allow them to do the job properly. Latitude north or south of the equator did not pose such a problem. It could be worked out by means of angular measurements of the sun and stars taken with relatively simple instruments. But to find longitude, equipment of an altogether different and superior caliber was needed, which could combine position measurements with time measurements. Throughout the span of known history, the invention of such equipment had remained beyond the capacities of scientists, but by the beginning of the 18th century, with rapidly increasing sea traffic, a mood of impatience and urgency had set in. In the words of an authority on the period, the search for longitude overshadowed the life of every man afloat and the safety of every ship and cargo. Cook did not have the benefit of a chronometer when he made his first voyage of discovery in 1768. By the time of his third voyage, however, 1778 to 79, he was able to map the Pacific with impressive accuracy, fixing not only the correct latitude, but the correct longitude of every island and coastline. Henceforward, quote, "Thanks to Cook's care and Harrison's chronometer, no navigator could have an excuse for failing to find a Pacific island, or for being wrecked on a coastline appearing from nowhere." End of quote. Indeed, with their accurate longitudes, Cook's Pacific maps must be ranked among the very first example of the precise cartography of our modern era. They remind us, moreover, that the making of really good maps require at least 3 key ingredients: great journeys of discovery, first-class mathematical and cartographic skills, and sophisticated chronometers. It was not until Harrison's chronometer became generally available in the 1770s that the third of these preconditions was fulfilled. This brilliant invention made it possible for cartographers to fix longitude precisely, something that the Sumerians, the ancient Egyptians, the Greek and the Romans, and indeed all other known civilizations before the 18th century were supposedly unable to do. It is therefore surprising and unsettling to come across vastly older maps which give latitudes and longitudes with modern precision. End of the entirety of Graham's quote. Those vastly older maps which the Age of Discovery suddenly recovered so as to cause itself to be an event, and a proto-capitalist event at that, is something which should be considered in detail. But in order to do that, we need to outline a few things about domination, this particularity being the exclusive right on knowledge, esoteric knowledge, or to give myself some credit, esoteric phronesis, i.e., a practical philosophy which have been systematically repressed and hidden, again to keep Adam and Eve on the plantation. However, that 3-part theory laid out by the late David Graeber, which just so happens will take us back to the Pacific coasts of the 3 Americas, Asia and the island groups in between, and ultimately obviously the whole world, and that seafaring communist community which we have been looking for, is something which we will have to go through in the next episode, together with other evidence as we continue our search for that chronometer. Here now to end things is that part Aboriginal Australian singer who walked the same outbacks as my own first mentor before he initiated me in a broken down temple called the Bright Moon in the hills outside Hangzhou in the great Song Chongguo, China, the man who taught me how to wander properly towards Sukhavati and who showed me my true face before my mother and father was born.
Give it time and we wonder why. We do what we can, laugh and we cry. Sleep in your dust because we've seen this all before. Culture fades with tears and grace, leaving us stunned, hollow with shame. We have seen this all before. Many tribes of a modern kind, doing brand new work, same spirit by side, joining hearts and hands in ancestral twine, Many tribes of a modern kind, doing brand new work, same spirit by side, joining hearts and hands in ancestral twine, ancestral twine. And slowly it fades, and slowly it fades, and slowly it fades, slowly it fades. Emana yo 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 yo, 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 emana yo 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 yo. Spirit bird, she creaks and groans, she knows she is. Seen this all before, she is. Seen this all before, she is. Spirit bird, she creaks and groans, she knows she is. Seen this all before, she is. Seen this all before, she is. And slowly it fades, slowly it fades, and slowly it fades, slowly it fades, slowly it fades. Emana yo 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 yo, 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 emana yo yo yo. Soldier on, my good countrymen, keep fighting for your cause, you know, keep fighting for your land. I know it's been thousands of years, and I feel your hurt, and I know it's wrong, and you feel you've been chained and broken and burned, and those beautiful old people, those wise old souls have been ground down for far too long by that spineless man, that greedy man, that heartless man, deceiving man, that government hand, taking blood and land, taking blood and land, and still they can, but you're dreaming, and your warrior spirit lives on, and it is so, so, so strong in the earth, in the trees, in the rocks, in the water, in your blood, and in the air we breathe. Soldier on, my good countrymen, keep fighting for your children now, keep fighting for your land. Slowly it fades, slowly it fades. Stand strong, keep the fire burning. Stick together, gotta keep the wheels turning. Forcing companies to stand aside, forcing government to recognize the power of this tribe. Stand strong, keep the fire burning. Stick together, gotta keep the wheels turning. Forcing companies to stand aside, forcing government to recognize the power of this tribe. Stand strong, keep the fire burning. Stick together, gotta keep the wheels turning. Forcing companies to stand aside, forcing government to recognize the power of this tribe. Stand strong, keep the fire burning. Oh, keep the fire burning. Give it time and we wonder why. Do what we can, laugh and we cry. Sleep in your dust because we've seen this all.